Hello everyone, and today we're going to be talking about measuring populations. So how do populations grow? What factors limit their growth? So the growth rate is the amount by which a population's size changes in a given amount of time, depending on birth rates, death rates, immigration, and emigration. So natality or birth rate, mortality or death rate, immigration or who's moving into a population. So think immigration, going in, emigration, exit. E for exit, I for in. So the growth rate of a population, immigration plus births adds individuals to a population, where emigration and deaths subtract individuals from a population. So we calculate growth rate by going births minus deaths divided by the total population, and birth plus immigration minus death plus emigration over the total population. So just make sure you remember PEMDAS when you're doing this. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So parentheses first, and then you're going to do addition and subtraction from left to right. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally's loud radio. So demographers will usually divide a large population into groups of 1,000 when calculating the total population. So this is per capita, and that's per individual. So if we have 52 births and 14 deaths per 1,000 individuals, the birth rate would be 52 over 1,000, or 5.2%. And this would be per capita per year, or 0.052 births per capita per year. So here's our practice question. If we have 52 births and 14 deaths per 1,000 individuals in a large population in 1 year, what is the growth rate of that population? So we would take the 52 births and subtract that from the 14 deaths. So 52 minus 14, we would get 38. Then divide it by the 1,000 individuals, because that's our population. That would give us 0.038. And then we're going to figure out a percentage, which would be 3.8%. To find the number of new individuals that would be added to the population, then we would multiply the growth rate by the total population. So in this case, our total population is 50,000. So we would take that 0.038 and then multiply it by the 50,000, and we would get 1,900 people. So multiply the growth rate by the total population. So here we have a growth rate per year. In China, they have a 0.48% growth rate. In India, 1.31% growth rate. The US, 0.78%. Indonesia, 1.04%. Brazil, 1.1%. So here's our second practice question. We have 52 births and 14 deaths per 1,000 individuals. In a large population, we have 12 immigrants and 5 emigrants. What is the growth rate? So we would have 52 immigrants means I going in, so we're going to add those to our birth rates. So 52 plus 12, that gives us 64. And then we're going to subtract that from 14 and 5 because emigrants are leaving. So 64 minus 19. And that's going to equal 45. So 45 over 1,000, which gives us that 0.4, or it gives us our 0.045. That 0.045 or 4.5%. So we have different types of growth models. This is the exponential growth model, and this occurs when a population has a steady growth rate. So what we see is we get this lag phase, and then it just starts growing crazy. And it's known as a J curve because if we look at it, it kind of looks like a J. It leads us to believe that a population will grow indefinitely. And if we look at the human population, this is kind of where the human population is right now. We just keep seeing this growth rate, and it just keeps growing. It's a steady growth rate. And so this is the exponential growth model because if we were to compare it to an exponent, what it would look like for a exponent graph would be, it would kind of look just like that. The start of a parabola or the start of an x to the third. It just keeps growing up and it grows quickly. So can populations grow indefinitely? What do you think? A population's growth rate is limited by what the available resources. So as long as there's available resources, the population will grow. However, in natural environments, resources tend to become scarce and harmful waste will accumulate. And so it'll reduce population size. And anything that's like that, anything that reduces population sizes, is known as a limiting factor. So as resources become scarce, that means competition will increase and causing each individual to obtain a smaller share of the resources. And this will decrease an individual's ability to fight off disease, grow, and reproduce. As a result, population's birth rates will decrease and the death rates will increase. And this will create that curve to end up looking like this, where we reach this thing called carrying capacity. So this is also known as the logistic growth model, or otherwise known as a S-curve. So here, logistic growth model, or the S-curve. And this is more typical of a population in the environment. We'll reach carrying capacity K, which will then even out the population. So what we end up seeing is more along the lines of, we get our lovely graph going, and I'll have our carrying capacity in red. So this is our carrying capacity. And we'll do it in green. So our population growth, our number of individuals will start to go up, and then it'll reach carrying capacity and go slightly over and then go slightly under, over, until it starts to even out and match that carrying capacity line. That's more of how it would look like in reality, because it's going to grow and it's going to go too much and then it'll go and immediately overcorrect and go down. But then, oh, look, it has room to grow some more. So it's going to grow and not as much as the last time on overpopulating, but still enough. And then it'll go down and up and down until it's almost indistinguishable from that carrying capacity line. This is also known as an S curve. So please remember J curve for exponential, S curve for logistics, because it looks like an S. So this builds on exponential model, but accounts for the influencing of the limiting factor. So carrying capacity K is the number of individuals that the environment can support over a long period of time. So this shows that the dependent upon resources and the limiting factors. So here we're seeing that this is for this fish right here. And we're seeing this lag phase, and it's going to start to grow, and up it's starting to decelerate because we have too much of the fish starting, and so it starts to go up and down toward around that carrying capacity line. So we get to this stable equilibrium. Please note that the independent variable here is time, and the dependent variable is the number of organisms. So the number of organisms is going to depend on the time. We have two different types of limiting factors that control population size. There's density independent factors, and this is your floods, your fires, your earthquakes, weather, and it's influences independent of a population. So the population doesn't affect a fire. The population doesn't affect a flood. It doesn't affect an earthquake or a volcano erupting. It's happening because it's happening. And it's going to reduce the population by the same proportion regardless of the population size. So our example down here is if a forest fire destroys a population of chipmunks, it doesn't matter if that population is only 1 chipmunk or 100 chipmunks. It's going to affect the chipmunks. So then we have density dependent factors, and this is going to be caused by the size or the density of that population. So this can be due to a shortage of food or nesting sites or places to sleep. And this is an individual's chances of surviving will depend on the number of organisms in the same area. So now we get to population fluctuations. We have this predator-prey graph. When the number of hare increase, a little bit later, the number of lynx will start to increase. And that's because there's now more hares. The number of predators, they now have more food. So because there's no more food, they don't have to worry about competition and they don't have to fight so much over the food. So now they can go and get more food for themselves, and look, there's more food for others. So they can now worry more about reproducing and eating. Eating is not one of their worries anymore. And the number of children will probably survive because they don't have to worry about food. However, when the number of lynx increase, well, this means now more hare are being eaten. So that means they're going to start to decrease. So what we're seeing here is this lovely sine cosine kind of graph. So we get a graph that looks like this, and a graph that kind of looks like this. It's not exact, but similar to what we get. It's more actually along the lines of this. Slightly one after the other. So when the number of hare decrease, well, now the lynx doesn't have enough food, so they're going to start to decrease. And so when the number of lynx starts to decrease, well, hey, now the lynx aren't eating them as much anymore. So now they can have babies and repopulate. And so now the number of hare is starting to increase again. So these are perils of small populations. Small populations are vulnerable to extinction because if they can't find a person to mate with, or if they can't have multiple children, it's going to make the population size really small. And the more that they interbreed in the same group, the more likely genetic defects will happen and the more likely some children will die at childbirth. So when populations are small, storms, fires, floods, and disease outbreaks can kill off entire populations. This leaves too few individuals to maintain a population. And when populations consist of just a few individuals, the likelihood of inbreeding increases. So this can create a genetic bottleneck, which is decreased genetic variability. This can say that they are less likely to adapt to environmental conditions changing, increased susceptibility to disease, and a reduced number of offspring. The more inbreeding, the more likely offspring will not be able to survive either birth or even pregnancy. A genetic bottleneck is when we have this limit right here, and what ends up happening is a bunch of traits managed to not make it through because something has happened which killed off a lot of things, or not they weren't able to move with. And so because of that, a lot of traits get left out. So for example, this purple circle, if it made it over here, but it's a recessive trait, that purple circle has been bred out. Or if it's a dominant trait and it manages not to be something that these green circles, red squares, and yellow squares doesn't want to breed with, then that purple circle is gone from the genetic variation. So here we have an example of a genetic bottleneck. So we have a bottle with the small little bottleneck. That's why it's called a bottleneck. And this is our original population. So then we get into seal hunting. And so the bottleneck, like the ones that weren't wanted, are the only ones that are left to breed. So we have only a few breeding. So here the example was 2 brown seals and 1 white seal. Well, those 3 seals are the only ones who survived, and so they're the only ones that can breed. So because they're the only ones that can breed, their genetics gets passed on to the next generation. So now we only have brown and white seals. All the gray and the black seals, dead, no longer there. So that's how a genetic bottleneck kind of works. We have 2 different types of feedback loops. We have positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. We're going to start with positive feedback loops. Positive feedback loops are input and output drive it to go to further extremes. So, for example, exponential growth of human population, more people are born. That means there's more people to give birth to further people, so we're going to continue having more people born. This is rare in nature but common in systems altered by human impact. To give an example of another natural one, when you have a cut and you're bleeding, your body starts showing that you're bleeding. Your body says, "Oh no, we're losing blood here. Send more blood to it." So it's going to send more blood. Well, you still have the cut, so you're losing blood. Oh look, we're losing blood. Send more blood, and it keeps going. It keeps going to that extreme. A negative feedback loop is when the input and output neutralize one another's effect, stabilizing the system. So this is if we get too hot, we sweat. When the sweat is evaporated, it cools us down. You're cool, no more sweat. Done. It creates systems that are able to persist. So to go back to the positive feedback loop with the bleeding, the negative feedback loop is when the platelets cover it up. When the platelets cover up the place where you're bleeding, it goes, hey, the negative feedback loop says, platelets covered this up. We're no longer losing blood there. Stop creating more blood to send there. And the body then stops creating more blood. A positive feedback loop is normally ended by a negative feedback loop. To go with another example for positive feedback loop, when a woman is having contractions, the woman will have contractions and it's a positive feedback loop. Oh, I'm having a contraction. Make more contractions. And it'll keep making more contractions until the placenta is out. Once the placenta is out, a negative feedback loop clicks in, saying placenta's out, stop making contractions, and then the body will stop contractions. So a negative feedback loop will create a system that's able to persist and stabilize the system, where a positive feedback loop makes more and more and more or takes away less and less and less until you reach an extreme.